Welcome to our webinar, Facing the Challenge, Monitoring and Evaluating. I'm Julia Rafelbear. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your incredible service and your leadership during these difficult times. Today's webinar is going to focus on how to organize for ongoing management of the crisis, both in the near term as well as in the long term. We're going to also talk about how to make the decision to change your school model. And we're going to discuss how to prepare for a remote fall, building off of our last webinar that did the day in the life simulations, and we will be doing simulations in a virtual setting today. I want to thank our colleagues both at McKinsey as well as the Council of Chief State School Officers for their incredible partnership in the series of webinars that we have been doing. We're incredibly grateful for your partnership. We are also joined today by our Chief in Residence, Pete Gorman. Today's webinar presenters will also include Leah Pollack and Jimmy Sarakasanis from our team at McKinsey. I'm going to pass the webinar now over to my colleague Leah Pollack from McKinsey, who will be taking us through the first part of our webinar. Thanks, Leah.
Great. Thank you, Julia. So today we're planning to talk about three topics. The first one is organizing for the ongoing challenge of COVID-19 and the ongoing crisis, and talking about how to think about that over a long time horizon, a longer time horizon. The second is in terms of making decisions on changing between different school models. And then the third is I'll hand it over to Jimmy to talk about preparing for a remote fall. So diving right into the first topic, here we want to take a step back and think about, really the last 4 months. So we've been, since March, many of you have been focused on and really in crisis mode over the past few months. What we know is looking out over the coming months is that it's really about planning for a longer term and how to think about what are lessons learned from other crises that really have not been resolved in the near term, but have been resolved over multiple months, and take organizing a team and organizing and engaging stakeholders over a long time horizon. And so in looking at other crises and looking at crisis management best practices in general, what we see are that there are 4 common pitfalls that many organizations face. The first is in terms of what we call inadequate discovery. So this could be everything from optimism bias. So for example, looking at research that might say, the transmission rate between children is low. That could be an example of optimism bias in terms of thinking about models. It could be, over-reliance on past patterns. So thinking about how you have dealt with other crises and applying the same approach to this one. But again, so one example is, how do you avoid and make sure, identify that you could be going into some of these patterns of not really taking in kind of the full suite of information. The second is in terms of what we call constrained solution design. So this is in terms of, not relying on just the normal patterns, the normal solutions, and thinking about how to address COVID-19. And so really figuring out the right construct to think outside the box, the right resources, the right potential external resources to engage, to ensure you really have more creative solution design. The third, and this is one that we really want to spend some time on today, is in terms of either slow or bad decision quality. And in many crises, this occurs because there's groupthink, it occurs because there's political pressure, there are a lot of emotions involved, different perspectives. And we know, in particular with schools being at the epicenter of you have political pressures, you have unions, there are boards involved, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different political pressures. And so this potential risk, this risk of a challenge that you could face in the ongoing management of COVID, of either slow or bad decision quality, is something that we want to give you tools for today to help address that, and to help you think through, how can you avoid that pitfall. And then finally, the last one that we often see is inadequate delivery. So this is really around execution, knowing that the chaotic nature of the crisis with a lot of changes, even the changes that we're seeing now in terms of planning for a hybrid start to the year and then switching to remote. How do you anticipate some potential changes that are going to have to be made in execution and plan for those given, given the evolving dynamic. So we're going to spend some time today about tools to help you mitigate these pitfalls that you could anticipate, knowing that there's a longer time horizon, and that this is not going to be resolved in the near term. So what we've laid out here are really 3 time horizons, and this is going beyond just the education, beyond the K-12 environment, and for all organizations really confronting COVID and thinking about planning for an ongoing response. The very near term, this first step is we call the respond phase. The next is rethink, and the longer term in terms of sustain. We think many of you are likely still in the respond, this first horizon, and this is because conditions are really changing by the day. We're getting daily updates in terms of case counts nationally, a lot of new updates even in terms of the insights on what's effective in fighting COVID. A lot of insights just emerging, research just emerging in terms of things like transmission and particularly the impact on children. Also in terms of how to address immediate challenges versus planning for the long term. In this first phase, it's very much the immediate term, near term daily issues that could be confronted, and also having the team to stood up. That you might be your organization structure could be evolving to address COVID, and so how are you both standing up but also being prepared to work in an agile way where you can put a team together to confront a problem and adjust as you need to. And then this last piece is also something that we'll be spending some time on today, is in terms of really getting the data, getting the guidance that's going to be helpful in terms of decision making. In looking at organizations that have managed crises over a long time horizon, there are several insights that we wanted to share with you. The first is in terms of how to organize the teams to focus on problems and not just historical functional roles. This is a really key topic in particular because we know many people in the early phases of responding to the crisis are spending 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, thinking about COVID-19. And so when you're planning for a longer time horizon, longer term response, this notion of how do you ensure that the responsibility is distributed across the team, and also how are you setting up cross-functional teams to address key challenges and address topics that are going to require input from multiple different people. The second is in terms of monitoring data. And we talked at the beginning about how important it is to make the fact-based decisions and to really have the data to help you inform those decisions. And we'll talk more about some examples of the data to track. The third is around operating at 2 speeds, both being able to really address any immediate near-term issues, but also having some team dedicated to thinking about the longer-term strategy. And also as a full leadership team, having meetings set aside to make decisions that are going to be required for longer-term topics. The fourth is around the maintaining external orientation. And this is really gaining insight, gaining facts to ensure that you're up to speed on insights on research that's coming up. And finally, and this goes back to really the first point about the team, is monitoring the pace of work, really to ensure that you are prepared for the long haul, that you're ready to address this over a period of months, not just days. So on the next slide, we'll go into the first topic in terms of organizing the team. So what we've shared on the left is a typical team structure with functional roles. So around operations, health and safety, academics, technology, and staffing. Here, kind of 2 things to highlight. The first is that you might find that for specific roles that you actually want to be really clear that some responsibilities related to COVID-19, the ongoing kind of planning and response, that you actually integrate those responsibilities into those roles. Or you might find that some topics are so important that you're actually creating new roles. So potentially in your technology team, you might need, with a plan to start school remotely, you might need certain roles dedicated to really support that in the near term. Kind of the second point that we wanted to highlight is around kind of, in addition to just thinking about the functional topics and the team you have in place, how are you organizing your team to address the cross-functional topics that will require input from multiple different team members? And so here we've shared the example of, remote student engagement. As you can see from this example, you would likely have team members involved from multiple different work streams, whether that's academics, technology, staffing. And here it's about having the actual team members with a sponsor, an executive sponsor, either at the cabinet level or potentially in the large district at cabinet -1. And also for this topic involving potentially key stakeholders from outside of the cabinet, outside of the team, to provide input. So you might have a parent perspective, or you might have a principal perspective, just to ensure that you're really getting the full input that you need. And the one thing in terms of the team members is making sure that both they are clear that they are responsible for helping to drive input and drive answers on this topic, but also to do that, you likely want to ensure that they've considered their other responsibilities and kind of have identified that they have the capacity to take this on. And if there's anything that they might need to deprioritize or reorient around to ensure that they can take on these responsibilities. On the next slide, what we've laid out is kind of one of the things that these cross-functional teams will do. So the first, really making sure that you're clear on what are the cross-functional topics that you think you need to bring different team members around to address. So on this page, we've identified some of the key topics that you might have the team members address: student engagement while remote, social and emotional learning, family engagement, and also what these teams will identify is what are the key metrics. Some of them are metrics that you may already be tracking. So you're already tracking attendance, already tracking participation. It will be different in a remote environment, but you'll also be tracking other data potentially. Potentially the number of check-ins, one-on-one check-ins between teachers and students, or potentially, what's the technology support that's being received. And so to think about, this is a longer list of metrics with more that are provided on the Chief for Change website. But also, so it's prioritizing these and also thinking, how are you going to collect them? How can you either through automated is there a way to automate the collection? And how are you actually going to incorporate that metrics into the decision-making process? And that's something that, in the next slides in terms of what's the meeting cadence and thinking about how you're balancing both the short-term and long-term. So here, this is this third topic in terms of both needing to address the near-term issues and near-term challenges that could come up, as well as longer-term. So continuing with the example of student engagement, you might have an issue that day in terms of students having challenges logging in. There could be, in terms of the student engagement team, they might find that they need to address it that day, and they would, in a daily stand-up, would raise that this is an issue and dive into what the challenge is and identify a solution. But what that team is also likely considering, potentially and it could be a broader set of team members, is are there challenges with student engagement? Are you finding that around in terms of submitting assignments that you're getting a low rate of submissions? And so thinking through on a weekly or monthly basis, kind of first of all, what's the data telling you on the submissions, and then what can you actually do? Are there things that you might want to do in terms of staffing? Are you sending potentially checking in with specific students, or having the academic team create additional tools? So again, two examples of two different challenges, one near term, one longer term, that the student engagement team might take on. And then on the next slide, we've teed up, what's the example of how this team might actually meet? And we're sharing this because we've heard from some districts actually thinking about how to shift the model from the current meeting structure, really in the functional roles, to more of how are you organizing around some of these cross-functional topics that this would be helpful. So here in this weekly schedule, the example of in a daily stand-up, the remote student engagement might have a daily huddle where they're addressing some of those issues, for example, with login. But in some of their weekly topics, their weekly touch points or monthly touch points, they could be addressing some of these longer term issues that the data is teeing up, the metrics that you're collecting are teeing up around students submitting assignments. And then on the next slide, we have what we wanted to do is just take a minute to pause and for you all to discuss with your teams and essentially say, you know, what are the big cross-functional topics that you think are going to be most important to address this year? And how are you thinking about organizing? What are you going to continue, or what might you stand up that's new to address these topics? Moving into the next section, we wanted to share some insights around how might you actually think about changing from one model to another. So you might be starting the school year in a remote model, but how are you planning for and how are you looking at data, and how are you thinking about potentially moving, either staying in that model or moving to different models throughout the year? So on the next slide, we've shared, you know, we know a number of districts have made the decision to start in a remote model. And one thing, you know, the number of cases in many of those areas were either a large number of cases or they were seeing the trend in terms of growing number of cases was occurring. But in many instances, there were also other factors in addition to case count that were contributing to the decision to go remote. And that could be in California, the state came out with very clear guidance, which we'll talk about in a minute, in terms of the criteria for when a school could open in person versus open remote. Also, you know, districts talking about the ability to test, the ability to contact trace, being a capability that they wanted to ensure. So really thinking about the readiness to open schools. In Georgia, there were decisions around really thinking about what were teachers saying, what were community members saying. So again, sharing, you know, it's really a number of inputs that are contributing to the decision to open remotely or open in other models. On the next slide, we also, you know, we've spent some time in these webinars talking about international examples. And what we wanted to share here is that, you know, we're seeing in other countries, you know, here in the UK, Germany, and South Korea, examples of schools opening and then needing to close again or shift to a different model for different reasons. So in Leicester in the UK, ordering the schools to close, so national government ordering local schools to close due to an outbreak, and saying that they would be closed for several months. In Germany, this was done at a state level, so the state chief minister announcing that a district would need to close due to an outbreak in meat processing factories. And in South Korea, again, you know, a health minister announcing the closure of over 500 schools due to an outbreak as well, and also issuing new lockdown measures. But in each of these examples, you see that the date of when the schools opened to when they had to shift to a different model was varied quite a bit. And so again, thinking about being prepared for the shift between models. On the next slide, we have laid out, you know, for the US specifically, what we're seeing is a couple of different examples of how, or a couple of different models in which districts are going to be making the decision about how to think about opening in person or opening remotely. And so in this first model on the left-hand side, we said, you know, in the state mandated model, the SCA is the primary decision maker. So really the SCA is laying out the guidance, or at the state level, the state's mandating how districts can approach moving between models, when to open in person versus when a remote or hybrid model is possible. In the second one, this is where the district is given, or the district has more input in terms of how to think about reopening. We're seeing some examples of districts actually tying to either state, county, or local reopening plans. And then finally, in the third model, this is where we're seeing examples of really the districts themselves are laying out the criteria for when to reopen. And on the next slide, we'll talk more specifically about what these different models look like. So in the first one, you know, California is an example of really the state being very clear on both the metrics and the thresholds at which schools can reopen. What they've also been clear about is not just when to go from to go in person, but also when districts might need to consider to go remote again. And so they've said, if 25% of schools in a district have to close, or if at least 5% of students and teachers have confirmed cases, that the superintendent will need to think about moving from a in-person to a remote model. In the second example, we thought the Lakewood district in Ohio was an interesting example because here they tied to county reopening plans. Whereas in the far left model in Miami-Dade, here this was the district saying that we have 8 criteria that we're going to follow in terms of thinking about when schools can be either in remote or in a different model. So on the following slide, we've shared a couple of different examples. Here what we wanted to say is that it's both, in those examples, clearly the health and epidemiological metrics are very important. And so these metrics include everything from the case count and prevalence to the testing rate, the positive test rate, contact tracing capabilities, hospital capacity. But the other piece of it that we know is very important for districts as well is system readiness and the resilience factors. And so this is where, and we spent time in the first webinar talking about things like calculating, what's the anticipated number of students who come back, or thinking about health and safety protocols. And so here it's thinking about, when you look at the different aspects of readiness to reopen, how are you doing in terms of the percent of equipment you need to ensure you have the right health and safety protocols in place, or the percent of students who could be transported, or what do you know in terms of staff, kind of their comfort in coming back. So again, these are other factors that we think that you will also want to be tracking and factoring in along with the health metrics and thinking about the decision to move from one model to another. On this next slide, here we've laid out, in terms of some of the sources of input that might be helpful for you as you're thinking about the decision making. So on the left, the Hopkins resources, which truly have been celebrated for providing a very transparent platform in terms of data on COVID. And so they have incredible resources in terms of case count, fatality rate, and a lot of data across the US as well as internationally. And also another example in terms of a resource, Resolve to Save Lives. And they have put forward, example, not just districts, but for organizations more broadly, in how to think about metrics to track and thresholds in terms of what moving between different models. And finally, the last slide before I hand it over to Jimmy is in terms of really thinking about the ongoing engagement and really the broad set of stakeholders that you as leaders will be engaging on an ongoing basis. And so, on the left-hand side here, we have just the ongoing collaboration within government. We know the state health agency will play such a critical role. We're seeing many examples of the state health agency actually being very clear about the metrics and the thresholds to track as they tie to the different models for schools and school and reopening. The SEA in terms of working and collaborating on specific topics, whether that's technology or devices, other tools that could be useful, and then also the school board. But we know that this ongoing engagement with the broader community, this is really the topic that we hear again and again is critical. And so both the involving community stakeholders in the decision-making process, as well as the ongoing, really the drumbeat of communications for disseminating information more broadly. And so here just a couple of examples, both from Canada in terms of setting up a body to really make sure that they had broad engagement from government to other, to local business, to ensure that they were on a regular basis engaging stakeholders. So kind of informal bodies, but also whether it's through surveys or other forums. And then finally, in terms of the communication, just this notion of thinking about all the different channels, both the channels of putting out information as well as getting input, and then being really clear on the regular communication cadence and new and different ways of engaging. And those are both the Denmark and Singapore examples here, is whether it's using phone lines or using chatbots, but to give parents, to give teachers resources to engage and provide input. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jimmy to talk through the third section on remote learning.
All right, thank you very much, Leah. So remote learning, we have all been here before. And the big question on everybody's mind is when we have to go here again, if we have to go here again, how can we make it different? One way to think about making this different is actually to think about it in a different way. In the spring, many of us were thinking, oh my gosh, how do we get devices? What technology do we need? What curriculum do we need to get to our students? What are we going to have them do? But now we have an opportunity to step back and actually ask, what do we want them to experience? What do we want our students' days to be like? What do we want our teachers' days to be like? What do we want our families' days to be like? So in this section, we're going to talk through what remote learning can look like, how we can plan for remote learning, starting with the experience. And the first set of questions that we want to ask ourselves are, how is a typical student's day going to be segmented? How much of their day should actually be digital versus non-digital? It doesn't all have to be digital. How much is going to be synchronous versus asynchronous? And when it's synchronous, how much of that day is in a large group, in a small group, or one-to-one? And when students are being supported by an adult, is that a teacher? Is it someone else from a school? Is it a family member? And how much of their day do we want them to be actually just working on their own? These questions will not be the same answers for every student. They will likely vary by age. They'll also likely vary depending on whether the mix of subjects that a student is engaged in throughout the day. For some sample schedules that take these things in mind, we've included some links both here and also other resources that are going to be useful as we go through this on the pages. When you can find the materials from this webinar on the website, please do click on. But the point here is, let's think about what our students are actually going to live. And once we think about what our students are actually going to live, how do we then map the experience of teachers and adults to this? We spoke last time about using this tool, the day in the life simulation, to think through an in-person day and the protocols along with that in our last webinar. We now want you to think about using this for a virtual day. Here we've taken the same student as last time, Malik, a 4th grade gen ed student, and walked through what one day could look like. And I want to point out a couple of things here. One, his day starts and ends with a synchronous session. In the morning, he's starting with his class. At the end of the day, he's starting with an adult. There's a mix of synchronous and asynchronous sessions throughout the day. He's not in front of a screen all day. He has time to eat lunch that is structured and scheduled. And he has a mix of large groups, small groups, and one-on-one. He also has a special and some other academic activities and some non-academic activities sprinkled into the synchronous sessions. We then want to take a deeper look at one part of his day. Because if that's the macro view, we then can think through all the specific details of what's going to happen, in this case, in his first session of instruction. What mode of instruction is going to be used? Is this a digital session? Is it synchronous or is it asynchronous? Is he one-on-one? Is it non-digital? How many students are going to be with Malik in his class? How many instructors are going to be working with Malik? Are they going to use breakouts? Are there any interactions in the class? What are the expectations? And is Malik going to turn in any work during this session? We've listed out some answers to these questions. Malik, in this case, is going to have one instructor, his homeroom teacher, along with one teacher's assistant during this session. He is going to submit his work through an online portal, which the instructor will check later. There is an expectation. And he is not supervised during this period. This is a time when his parent can have a break. But he is supposed to be checked in on at the end of this session. Now, as we do this, just like we did with the day of the life simulation last time, we want to also ask ourselves, what if some things go wrong? What happens if he loses Wi-Fi during the class? Does he have to log back on? Is there someone he's supposed to call? Does he send a message some way? What happens if the instructor loses Wi-Fi? Do all the students know what they're supposed to do if their teacher logs off in the middle of a session? And finally, what do we do about attendance? Who's in charge of attendance? What's the expectation and whose responsibility is it if he doesn't log in properly? So if this is the view from Malik, we then also want to ask ourselves, what's the view from Ms. Gomez? Because all of these student experiences, as carefully as we design them, will only work if we also design teacher experiences just as carefully. So again, we've mapped out Ms. Gomez, who's a 5th grade elementary school teacher, for her fully remote day. Again, notice that we have a mix of planning, synchronous instruction time, some time for grading and feedback, and some scheduled breaks in Ms. Gomez's day, but it is a structured day. She has a mix of large group, small group, and one-on-one time with her students. And that time is spent sometimes on instruction, but sometimes on relationships and community building. And then she also has some time built in during planning to contact families or to allow families to contact her. Again, let's look at one specific slice of Ms. Gomez's day, her first session of instruction. How does she start the lesson? In this case, she starts with a mindfulness exercise to get her students in the mood, hopefully sitting down in their seats. And then she explains the structure of the class. What modes of instruction is she going to use? Is it a large synchronous session? Is it a one-on-one synchronous session? Is the expectation that she gives an introduction and students work independently offline? Well, in this case, it's going to be a full hour of live instruction with the full class, 40 minutes of individual digital program work, and then with 5 minutes of wrap up led by Ms. Gomez. So she will open, students will work, she'll close. How does she decide? Well, in this case, the district has provided guidance, very specific guidance. In this case, we also have questions for Ms. Gomez to think ahead on what could go wrong. What happens if a student or a family member messages her before class that their device isn't working and they can't join? Is that an excused absence or an unexcused absence? Does she report that as a technical issue? Does she follow up after class, send resources or a recording of the session? Are the lessons recorded at all? All things that Ms. Gomez is going to need to have thought through or have thought through for her before this session starts. What does she do if a student either in the class or before the class is given a subpar score on a wellness check? Is she going to use time in that session to check in on the student? Is she going to do it in some other way? Will she report this to someone else whose job it is to check in on the student? Again, things that Ms. Gomez will almost certainly experience that we want to get ahead of as much as possible. In our last webinar, we talked about this day in the life simulation as being both a tool for planning, in this case of structuring out what we want the student and teacher experience to be, and by extension also family experience. But also we talked a lot about how it could be used as a communication tool. So we've laid out here, especially for remote, when parents and other family members are going to be very intimately involved in the experience of the day, how might you use this? Well, you can give it as you can use this tool just to give an overview of the journey. What's it going to feel like? You can use it to figure out what the most frequently asked questions are and answer those. It can also be a handbook for students, for teachers, and for families on what they should do and how they should prepare for these new experiences. Once you have these experiences defined, and again, not all of remote learning needs to be done digitally, but some of it will need to be. So if you have these experiences defined, then it's time to ask the questions of how do we enable this and support this with technology, both in platforms and software, but also devices. We know everyone has been asking, how do we get enough devices to students? How do we make sure we have a platform for synchronous sessions for assignment submission, et cetera, that can support all the ways of interacting that we want. But we also need to ask questions about cost, fit with our existing infrastructure, and frankly, time to implement, especially those of us who only recently have decided to go fully virtual and don't have and are further behind on the planning. We do need to ask the question of how long will it take to implement these things? How long will it take? Are our devices actually going to arrive on time? And if not, what are we going to do about those things? It's also likely that when you get to this step, you're going to find some of the things that you thought you wanted to do when setting up the student's experience or the teacher's experience may not be possible with these constraints. So these steps will likely be iterative. Once you define your experience, then you figure out what you can do with technology. You may have to go redesign the experience a little bit, and it's likely going to be iterative throughout the year as you figure this out. So keep that in mind, but always return back to the student experience and the family experience and the teacher experience. Finally, this is not the first time that students have had full-time virtual instruction in the US or elsewhere. So we wanted to share some examples of things that either full-time virtual schools or others who have done this in prior years outside of the context of the current crisis have tried to make virtual learning as good as, if not sometimes potentially better for some students and for all students. So for students, we've seen schools create a dedicated text or chat line, potentially even 24/7, because not all students sleep at the same times. For at-risk students, especially, to connect with an experienced tutor or a peer. We seem to maintain a routine of a typical school day. So not everything can feel exactly like school, but you can start with a morning check-in, have a midpoint touch point, and an afternoon checkout. Again, on this theme that not everything has to be digital, many virtual schools don't just send computers to their students. They send big boxes of books, printed materials, manipulatives, and other physical resources. You can even go on YouTube and find videos of people having celebratory parties to open their gift of curricular materials for the year. For families, excellent virtual schools dedicate family support teams to answer questions about the changing school experience for those family members who are most responsible for supporting their children. They provide templated communication materials for the first day of school and the first week to be sent out by both teachers and school principals, because this onboarding process is critical in helping people understand both the routine, but also the expectations. We've also seen, and we're seeing some districts plan for this, two models and 2 sessions for a school day, a morning shift and an evening shift or an afternoon shift, to help accommodate working families, to give them some time where they're not supervising their students' learning. And finally, for school staff, we see effective virtual schools providing teachers with sample exercises to build in social and emotional skill building, give them actual things they can do, dedicate time for daily staff stand-ups so that staff still feel like staff, even if they're working from home or sleeping in their office. We see schools pair teachers together so they can observe each other's student engagement models in virtual classrooms, trade tips with each other in a low risk, low pressure setting, just peer-to-peer. And finally, just as we see dedicated support lines for students, we see effective schools providing dedicated staff support for technical needs and assistance. We now look for you with your teams to ask some questions of yourselves. How is your district currently thinking about improving student experience in the remote learning model? And what are some challenges that are likely going to happen once the academic year begins, and how can you get ahead of those? We'd like to thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. You can find the materials and a recording of this session on the Chiefs for Change website. And thank you for all that you do.